The feedback hit before the words did, that thin electric squeal that makes everyone's shoulders come up around their ears. And then my aunt's voice rolled out over the lake, amplified, unmistakable, carrying all the way past the dock and the string lights and the folding tables loaded with potato salad. And let's be honest, we all saw this coming. She was never going to amount to anything. I love her, I do, but some people just aren't built for more than what they've got. I was standing maybe 15 feet away with a plate of my grandmother's deviled eggs still balanced in my hand, and I felt the exact second 40 conversations died at once. Someone's fork clinked against a glass and stopped. A kid stopped chasing another kid. My mother's face went the color of the paper tablecloths. Aunt Carol was still turned half away from the podium, laughing lightly at whatever she just said to my Uncle Frank, completely unaware that the little lapel mic clipped to her blouse, the one she'd used 2 minutes earlier to toast my grandmother's 80th birthday, was still live, still broadcasting through both speakers hung from the pergola, still catching every word. I remember setting the plate down on the nearest table very slowly, like sudden movement might make it worse. I remember my cousin Whitney's mouth falling open. I remember thinking, with a strange, floating calm that didn't match anything else happening in my body, so that's what she actually thinks. You understand how I ended up standing at the edge of that lake, holding a plate of deviled eggs while my whole family heard my aunt say out loud what she'd apparently believed about me for 20 years. I have to go back to a kitchen table in a rented house that always smelled like coffee grounds and cut grass, back before any of this had a shape yet, back to when Carol and my mother were just two sisters, and I was just a kid who hadn't done anything wrong yet. My mother, Diane, was the younger of the two. Carol was older by 4 years, and in my grandmother's telling, Carol had always been the capable one, the one who organized the church bake sales, who married a man who owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties, who had a daughter, my cousin Whitney, who did everything early and did it well. Whitney walked at 9 months. Whitney read chapter books in 1st grade. Whitney made varsity tennis as a freshman. My mother, on the other hand, married my father at 22, had me at 24, and was divorced by the time I was 7. Left with a duplex apartment on the wrong side of town and a job as a night shift nurse at the regional hospital. I don't say any of this to make my mother sound like the family's cautionary tale, because she wasn't, she was, and is one of the strongest people I've ever known, but that's not how Carol told the story at family gatherings, and stories, when they get told often enough by the loudest person in the room, start to calcify into fact. By the time I was old enough to understand what people meant when they talked about me in that particular tone of voice, the story had already been written. Diane's daughter. The one from the apartment, the one whose father left. I want to be clear that my childhood wasn't some unrelenting siege. There were good years, or at least good stretches inside difficult years. Whitney and I were close when we were small, genuinely close, in the way cousins can be before anyone's told them they're supposed to be competing. We built forts out of my grandmother's porch furniture. We caught fireflies in mason jars with holes punched in the lids by my grandfather, who died when I was 9 and who I remember mostly as a smell of pipe tobacco and a low, patient voice. Grandma Ruth's house had a screened-in porch that faced the lake, and every summer, for as long as I could remember, the whole extended family would gather there for the 4th of July and again around Labor Day. And those days had a rhythm to them that I loved: the smell of charcoal, the sound of my Uncle Frank's terrible jokes, the way the adults' laughter would get looser and louder as the evening went on. It was at one of those gatherings, the summer I was 11, that I first understood the particular shape of my aunt's disapproval. We'd all just gotten our report cards, and somehow, I don't remember whose idea it was, though I suspect it was Carol's, the adults had decided it would be charming to have all the kids show their grades around the table like party favors. Whitney had a stack of A's, a couple of A+, and a note from her teacher about exceptional promise. I had B's and C's and a D in math that I'd been dreading showing anyone, because I already knew, in the vague, pre-verbal way kids know things, that math was going to be a problem for me. I found out years later in college that I have a processing disorder that makes numbers behave like they're swimming on the page, but at 11 I just knew that the numbers didn't sit still for me the way they seemed to for everyone else. When my report card came around the table and landed in front of Carol, she looked at it for a long moment, long enough that the porch got quiet, and then she said, not unkindly exactly, but not kindly either, "Well, not everyone can be Whitney, I suppose." A few people laughed, the soft, reflexive laugh adults do to smooth over something uncomfortable. My mother's jaw tight. I remember looking down at the report card like it had betrayed me. That could have been a single bad moment, the kind every family has, forgotten by the next summer. It wasn't. It became a pattern, one incident laid on top of another, each one slightly worse than the last, the way water slowly reshapes a stone. The next year it was the school talent show. I'd worked for weeks on a piano piece badly because I am not and never was musically gifted, and I forgot the bridge halfway through and had to start over, my face burning under the gymnasium lights. Carol found me afterward in the hallway where I was trying not to cry, and instead of comforting me, she said, "You know, sweetheart, some people just aren't performers. There's no shame in that. Whitney's actually been asked to audition for the county orchestra. Did you hear?" I hadn't asked her about Whitney. I don't think I'd asked her anything at all. By the time I was in high school, the comparisons had become almost ambient, a kind of weather that moved through every family dinner. Whitney got into an honors program, I got put on an academic support plan, and Carol asked, in front of my mother, whether I'd considered that maybe college just isn't for everyone, and that's fine, someone has to work retail. Whitney got a scholarship offer to State University with a strong pre-law track. I applied to 3 schools and got into one, a smaller regional college 2 hours from home, and Carol's response, delivered at Thanksgiving with a glass of wine in her hand and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, was, "Well, good for you for trying. Not everyone gets in where they want." I hadn't told anyone where I'd wanted to go. I don't think I'd fully admitted it to myself. There was another incident I've never quite been able to shake, one from the summer between 8th and 9th grade that I think about more than almost any other. My grandmother had decided to throw a small graduation party for me, moving up from middle school, nothing elaborate, just cake and lemonade on the porch. But she'd made a point of inviting the whole family, and I remember feeling for once like the day belonged to me instead of to Whitney, who had nothing being celebrated that particular week. Carol arrived late with a wrapped gift that turned out to be a set of art supplies, which was kind, genuinely kind, and for about 20 minutes I let myself believe the day might just be a good one straight through. Then over cake, my great-aunt from Florida asked me, with real warmth, what I wanted to be when I grew up, and before I could answer, Carol said, laughing lightly, "Oh, we're still working on getting her through algebra one thing at a time," and the table laughed along with her, the easy, complicit laugh of people who didn't realize or didn't care that the joke had a target sitting 3 feet away holding a paper plate. My grandmother shot her a look that summer, the first time I remember her doing that, but she didn't say anything out loud, not yet, and I went upstairs after the cake was cut and sat on the edge of the guest bed for a while before coming back down, because I didn't want anyone to see that a wrapped set of colored pencils and one sentence could exist in the same 10 minutes, and somehow the sentence was the only part that stayed with me for years afterward. My mother fought for me in ways I didn't fully appreciate until I was older. I remember one Thanksgiving, I was maybe 16, when Carol made some comment about how some kids just take longer to find themselves, and that's okay, not everyone peaks in high school. And my mother set her fork down so hard it clattered against the plate and said, "Carol, she's sitting right there." Carol's eyebrows went up in that particular way of hers, the picture of wounded innocence. "I'm not saying anything bad, Diane, I'm just being realistic. Someone has to be." My mother didn't say anything else that night, but in the car on the way home she reached over and squeezed my hand at a red light and said, "Don't you let her get inside your head, you hear me, don't you let her." I said I wouldn't. I was lying a little. She was already inside my head. She'd been moving in slowly for years, unpacking boxes, hanging pictures, making herself at home. College lasted 3 semesters. I want to be honest about why, because it would be easy to make it sound like a single dramatic collapse, and it wasn't. It was a slow accumulation of things, the way most real failures are. I was working 20 hours a week at a coffee shop to help cover what my financial aid didn't. I was struggling in 2 classes that required the kind of math I'd never been able to hold on to, and underneath all of it was a low, constant hum of anxiety that I now understand, with the benefit of therapy and hindsight, was something closer to depression than to garden-variety stress. I called my mother in the spring of my 2nd year, sitting on the floor of my dorm room with my back against the bed frame, and told her I couldn't do it anymore. Not the specific classes, all of it. She didn't tell me I was making a mistake. She said, "Okay, come home, we'll figure it out." I have never loved her more than I did in that moment, and I don't think I fully understood until much later how much courage it took her to say that, given what she knew was coming from her sister. What came from her sister came fast. I moved back into the duplex, into my old bedroom that my mother had turned into a sewing room and then turned back. And within 2 weeks, Carol had somehow found out, I suspect through my grandmother, who couldn't keep a secret from her if her life depended on it, and called my mother to check in, which really meant she wanted the details so she could deliver them properly at the next gathering. That gathering happened to be Easter at Grandma Ruth's house, and I remember sitting at the table watching Carol actually wait, for a lull in the conversation the way a person waits for a stoplight. And then she said to the table at large, but really to me, "I heard you're back home." That must be a relief. Honestly, college isn't for everyone, and there's no shame in figuring that out sooner rather than later. Whitney's doing her law school applications right now, if you can believe it. Time really does move differently for different people. I remember Whitney, who was 20 at the time and had clearly heard this kind of thing her whole life too, looking down at her plate with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between embarrassment and a kind of tired resignation, like she'd watched this scene play out enough times that she no longer had the energy to intervene. Those first few months back home were harder than I let anyone see. I remember lying awake most nights turning the same thoughts over, that I'd proven Carol right, that I'd handed her the exact ending she'd been narrating my whole life, that somewhere out there she was probably already rehearsing the way she'd tell this part of the story at the next holiday. My mother noticed I wasn't sleeping and didn't push, just started leaving the porch light on and a plate of something in the fridge for whenever I finally came downstairs. Small, quiet gestures that said, without needing words, that she hadn't gone anywhere and wasn't going anywhere. It took me the better part of that first summer to stop apologizing to her for existing in her spare room again at 20 years old. I took a job at a diner 2 towns over, the kind with vinyl booths and a pie case by the register. And I worked there for almost 2 years while I tried to figure out what I actually wanted, separate from what I'd failed to become. The owner, a heavy-set man named Gene who'd run the place since before I was born, was the first adult outside my mother who ever told me I was good at something without immediately attaching a but to it. I'd started coming in early to help with the morning prep, and one day, watching me portion out biscuit dough, he said, "You've got hands for this, you know. Some people do, some people don't, you do." It was such a small thing to say, and I've never forgotten it because it was the first time in years that a compliment had landed without my automatically waiting for the second half of the sentence, the part where it turned out to be conditional. It was during that time that I found the thing that would eventually change everything, though I didn't know it yet. I started baking. Not seriously, not at first. My mother had an old KitchenAid mixer that had belonged to my grandmother, and on my days off I started making bread, then pastries, then elaborate layer cakes I had no reason to make except that the process of it, the precision, the waiting, the way flour and butter and sugar became something else entirely if you paid close enough attention, was the first thing in years that had quieted the noise in my head. I brought a lemon cake to a diner coworker's birthday, and 3 people asked where I'd bought it. I brought cinnamon rolls to my mother's nursing station, and her coworkers started asking, half joking, if I'd sell them some. Within a year, I was doing small orders out of our kitchen on the side, birthday cakes, a few wedding cakes for people who couldn't afford the fancy bakeries downtown, holiday cookie boxes. It wasn't much, it was mine. I didn't tell Carol about any of it for a long time, mostly because I'd learned by then to keep the things that mattered to me away from her line of sight, the way you'd keep a young plant out of a hard frost. But my grandmother found out the way my grandmother found out about everything, and she mentioned it at a family dinner with real pride in her voice. "Did you know our girl's been baking?" Diane says people are asking her to do their weddings now, and I watched Carol's face do the thing it always did, a kind of quick recalibration, deciding how to respond to information she hadn't pre-approved. What she said was, "That's sweet, it's good to have a hobby." The word hobby landed exactly where she meant it to land. Here is where I want to talk about the part of this story that still confuses me a little, even now, even with everything I know about how it ended. Because for about 8 months, starting the spring I turned 26, it seemed like something between Carol and me had actually shifted. It started at a birthday dinner for my grandmother, not the big reunion, just a smaller family dinner at a restaurant, where Carol mentioned, almost in passing, that she was on the planning committee for a charity gala her country club hosted every autumn, raising money for the children's hospital, and that they were between caterers because the usual company had double booked. She looked at me, actually looked at me, which felt unfamiliar, and said, "You do all that baking. Do you do savory things too, full menus?" I said I'd been doing more of that lately, small dinner parties, a few corporate lunches. She said, "Send me your information, I'll pass it along to the committee." I remember driving home that night feeling something I hadn't let myself feel around Carol in years, which was hope. I sent her my menu portfolio that same week, along with photos from a 40th anniversary dinner I'd done the month before, and for 3 days I heard nothing, which was long enough for the old, familiar voice in my head to start explaining why of course it hadn't gone anywhere. Of course she looked at the photos and quietly decided I wasn't country club material. Then on a Thursday evening she called me directly, which she almost never did, and said, "The committee loved it. They want to do a full-plated dinner, not just appetizers. Can you handle 300? I remember standing in my kitchen holding the phone away from my ear for a second just to make sure I'd heard her right. "I can handle 300, I said, and my voice came out more confident than I felt, though I meant to make it true by the time October came around. She laughed, a real laugh, and said, "I told them my niece runs a serious operation. Don't make a liar out of me." It was such a small thing, being vouched for instead of apologized for, and I drove to my mother's that same night just to tell her about it in person. Both of us sitting at the kitchen table until almost midnight going through possible menus like it was Christmas morning. The gala was in October at the country club, 300 guests, and it was up to that point the single largest event I'd ever catered. I spent 6 weeks planning the menu, testing recipes, calculating quantities until my kitchen counter was covered in scrawled math that, for once, I actually enjoyed doing because it was in service of something I loved. My mother took 2 days off work to help me prep. The night of the event, I stood in the country club's kitchen in a black chef's coat I'd bought specifically for the occasion, watching servers carry out trays of the food I'd made. And at one point Carol came back into the kitchen, flushed, glowing, clearly having had a couple of glasses of wine, and put her hand on my arm and said in front of the catering staff, in front of the club's event coordinator, "This is my niece. Isn't this incredible? I'm so proud of her." I cried a little in the walk-in cooler afterward where no one could see me, because it was the first time in my adult life I could remember her saying those words, proud of her, and meaning, apparently, every syllable of it. For a few months after that, things really did seem different. Carol texted me a photo of a friend's engagement party she thought I should bid on catering. She asked, at Thanksgiving, real questions about how the business was going and seemed to actually listen to the answers. My mother, cautiously, optimistically, said to me one night while we were doing dishes, "Maybe she's finally coming around." I wanted so badly to believe that. I think some part of me had been waiting my whole life for exactly that sentence to be true. It fell apart in January at a smaller gathering at Carol's house, one of those post-holiday get-togethers where everyone's a little tired and the guard comes down. I'd stepped out onto the back patio to take a phone call from a client, and when I came back in through the side door, I could hear Carol's voice from the kitchen before I could see her, talking to any of her country club friends, a woman named Pamela I'd met maybe twice. "She's cute, and honestly the gala food was better than I expected," Carol was saying, laughing a little, "but let's be real, it's just a hobby that got a little out of hand. I don't think anyone should get their hopes up that it's going anywhere serious. You know how it is with kids like that, they need something to feel good about." I stood in the mudroom with my coat half off, one arm still in the sleeve, and I don't think I moved for almost a full minute. Kids like that. I was 26 years old. I had a business license and a tax ID number and a growing client list, and to her I was still apparently a kid who needed something to feel good about, a charity case she'd extended out of some private calculation I would never fully understand. I put my coat back on and left without saying goodbye to anyone, and I didn't tell my mother what I'd heard for almost 2 weeks because I didn't have the words for it yet, and because some small, stubborn part of me was still hoping I'd misheard. I hadn't misheard. I found that out for certain a month later when I got a text from a friend who'd been at the gala as a guest, forwarding me a post Carol had made on the club's community page back in October, one I'd never seen because I wasn't a member and wasn't tagged. The post had a photo of one of my dessert tables and a caption that read, "So proud to have found this hidden gem for tonight's event, my niece, who's finally doing something with her life after a rocky few years." Sometimes the underdogs surprise you. 312 likes. 40-some comments, most of them kind, a few of them from people I didn't know, saying things like, "What a sweet aunt and good for her, glad she found her way." I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time, feeling something that was less like anger and more like a very specific, very cold clarity. She hadn't been proud of me. She'd been proud of the story she got to tell about me, the redemption arc, the underdog who surprised everyone, with herself cast as the generous relative who'd given the poor girl a chance. It had never actually been about the food or the work or me. It had been about a narrative she could perform for an audience, and once the performance ended, so did the pretense underneath it. I didn't confront her about it. I want to be honest about that because it would be a better story if there'd been some clean, satisfying scene where I called her out and she apologized and we hashed it all out like reasonable adults. That's not what happened. What happened is that I got quieter around her, more careful, more closed. I still went to the family gatherings because my grandmother asked me to. Because I loved my grandmother and my mother, and even in a complicated way, Whitney, who I'd started talking to more honestly as we both got older, who had confided in me once over wine that she sometimes hated being held up as the standard because it meant nobody ever asked her how she was actually doing. They just assumed she was fine because Whitney was always fine. Whitney was the one who was going to amount to something. I remember being surprised at how much that confession moved me, how it complicated the flat, easy resentment I'd carried toward her for years. We weren't in competition. We'd both just been cast without our consent in a play written by someone else. The reunion, the big one, the one for my grandmother's 80th birthday, had been planned for almost a year by the time it actually happened. Grandma Ruth wanted everyone there, cousins from 3 states, my great-aunt from Florida, old family friends who'd known her since before any of us were born, and she wanted it at the lake house. The same screen porch and the same dock where I'd caught fireflies as a kid, because she said, with the particular bluntness that comes with turning 80, "I don't know how many more of these I've got in me, and I want the good one to be at home." My mother helped coordinate the food. I offered to do the cake, a 4-tier lemon and raspberry cake that took me 2 full days, and I remember standing in my kitchen the night before the party, piping the last of the sugared flowers onto the top tier, feeling something close to peace for the first time in a long while. Whatever else was true about my family, I loved my grandmother uncomplicatedly, and I wanted the day to be good for her. The party itself for the first 2 hours was good. String lights strung between the porch posts and the old oak tree. A folding table of family photos going back decades. My grandmother as a young woman in a swimsuit at that same dock, my grandfather in his army uniform. Kids running through the grass with sparklers even though it wasn't yet dark. My mother in a blue dress I hadn't seen her wear in years, laughing with her sister-in-law by the drinks table, looking for once unguap. Dead, even Carol seemed, if not warm, then at least contained, polite, performing the role of gracious hostess-adjacent family member, the role she was, admittedly, very good at. The toast started around 7 once the sun had started to go gold over the water. Uncle Frank went first, some fond, rambling story about the first time he met my grandmother, which got a good laugh. Then my mother, who talked about how their mother had taught her to be strong even when strong wasn't easy, and I watched Grandma Ruth's eyes fill up. Then it was Carol's turn, and she took the little clip-on mic that had been set up so everyone at the back could hear over the water, and she talked for a while about family, about legacy, about how proud their mother would be to see everything the family had built. It was a good toast, genuinely, I'll give her that. She thanked my grandmother for teaching her the importance of appearances, of doing things properly, of never letting the family down in front of others, phrases that would sound different to me only in hindsight. Then she said something about how every family has its stories, the ones who soar early like Whitney and the ones who take the long way around, and she gestured vaguely in a direction that included me without quite naming me, and there was a ripple of soft, uncertain laughter, the kind people do when they're not sure if they're supposed to be laughing. She raised her glass, said, "To Mom, to 80 years of holding this family together, even when some of us made it harder than others," and everyone drank, and she stepped back from the podium and set the mic down on the little table beside it, except she didn't turn it off. She'd never known how, honestly, my uncle had always handled the sound equipment, and he'd stepped away to refill the cooler. She drifted toward the drinks table where Frank was standing, and I was maybe 15 feet away, refilling a tray of deviled eggs my grandmother had made, close enough to see her face but not close enough, apparently, for her to remember I was in the vicinity. Frank said something I didn't catch, and Carol laughed, and then in the easy conversational tone people use when they think they're speaking privately, she said the words that went out over both speakers, out past the string lights, out over the water, into the ears of every single person on that porch and lawn. And let's be honest, we all saw this coming. She was never going to amount to anything. I love her, I do, but some people just aren't built for more than what they've got. The feedback squeal came first, that thin electric shriek, and then her voice, huge and unmistakable, filling the whole yard. I remember setting the tray of deviled eggs down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't trust them not to drop it. I remember the sudden, total silence, not just quiet, but a specific held breath kind of silence. 40 or 50 people all realizing at the same moment what had just happened and who it had just happened to. I remember my mother's face, white, turning first toward the speaker and then toward me. I remember Whitney's mouth open, one hand halfway to her face. I remember my grandmother, 80 years old, sitting in her chair of honor near the podium, going very still. Carol realized what had happened almost immediately. You could watch it land on her face, the color draining and then rushing back in a hot, mortified flush, her hand flying to the mic clipped to her blouse, fumbling with it, finding no obvious way to make it stop existing. Oh my God," she said, and that came through the speakers too. "Turn that off, someone turn that off." Uncle Frank lunged for the little mixing board on the folding table and killed the sound. And the silence that followed was worse than the noise had been, because now it was just a yard full of people looking at me and me looking at Carol and nobody saying anything at all. I don't know exactly how long I stood there. It felt long. What I remember most clearly is that underneath the humiliation, underneath the specific hot sting of hearing finally out loud in front of everyone what I'd suspected for 20 years, there was something else too, something almost like relief. She'd said it. She'd finally said the actual thing, not the coded version, not the hobby version, not the not everyone gets in where they want version. She'd said it plainly enough that no one in that yard could pretend they hadn't heard it, could pretend I'd been imagining things all these years, could tell me I was too sensitive or reading into things that weren't there. Every single person on that lawn had just heard it too. "Lena," Carol started, moving toward me, her voice pitched high and fast in the particular register of someone trying to undo something that cannot be undone. "That came out completely wrong, I didn't mean." "You meant it," I said, my voice came out steadier than I expected, steadier than I felt. "You've meant it for 20 years, you just usually say it quieter." "That's not fair," she said, and I watched her glance around at the gathered, silent faces, recalibrating the way she always did, trying to find the version of this moment she could survive in front of an audience. "You're taking one comment." "One comment I heard," my mother said, and I turned to see her walking toward us, her face no longer white but flushed with a kind of anger I had rarely seen from her, the anger of someone who has swallowed something for a very long time and has just finally stopped swallowing it. "One comment everyone here just heard. How many times have you said it when the mic wasn't on, Carol? How many Thanksgivings? How many Christmases?" "Diane, don't." "No, I think we should," my grandmother said, and her voice, though quieter than either of theirs, cut through the yard in a way that made both of them stop. She was still sitting, one hand braced on the arm of her chair, but she was looking at her older daughter with an expression I'd never seen her wear before, something between grief and a very old, very tired disappointment. "I think we should talk about it, Carol, because I have heard you say things like that to this girl since she was 11 years old, and I have let it go every single time because I told myself it wasn't my place, that you were her mother's sister and it wasn't mine to referee. That was my mistake. I'm 80 years old today and I am done making it." Carol's face did something complicated. I watched 30 years of being the capable one, the together one, the one who never got told she was wrong, collide with the fact that she was standing in a silent yard being corrected by her own mother in front of the entire family. "I built a career," she said, and her voice had an edge to it now, defensive. "I raised a daughter who's about to be a lawyer. I don't think it's unreasonable that I expected." "Expected what?" I said. I was surprised at how calm I sounded, how the shaking in my hands had settled into something else, something clearer. "That I'd fail so you'd have somewhere to put your standards. Carol, I run a business. I've catered 40+ events this year. I bought my own place last spring with money I saved myself. I did all of that without a single word of encouragement from you. And the one time you did encourage me, I found out later it was because you needed a story to post on the club's Facebook page about your charitable niece. I heard you tell Pamela it was just a hobby that got out of hand. I heard you call me a kid who needed something to feel good about. So don't stand here now and act like tonight was some kind of accident. The mic was an accident, what you said wasn't." The porch was so quiet I could hear the water lapping against the dock pilings behind us. Whitney had come to stand near her mother, and I watched her face, not shocked anymore, past shocked, into something that looked almost like relief on someone else's behalf, the look of a person watching a story finally get told correctly after years of it being told wrong. "Mom," Whitney said quietly, "she's right, you do this. You've always done this." Carol looked at her daughter like she'd been slapped. "I don't need this from you two." "You kind of do," Whitney said, and her voice shook a little, but she kept going. "I've watched you do this to her our whole lives and I never said anything, and I should have. I'm sorry, Lena, I should have said something a long time ago." Carol stood there for a moment longer, looking around at the yard, at Frank, who wouldn't meet her eyes, at Grandma Ruth, whose chin was set in a way that meant she wasn't going to soften this, at my mother, at me, at her own daughter, and something in her posture finally broke, the performance dropping away all at once, leaving something smaller and more human underneath it. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," she said, and this time her voice was quieter, less defended. I don't know why I say things like that. I think I've just always needed there to be someone who wasn't doing better than me or than mine, and I'm ashamed of that, and I'm sorry, and I know that's not enough right now." She wasn't looking at the crowd anymore, she was looking at me. "I am sorry, Lena, I don't expect you to accept it tonight. I don't think I would in your place." I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, and I'd promised myself somewhere in the last 5 minutes that I wasn't going to smooth this over just because it was easier for everyone else at the party. For a moment nobody moved, and then my grandmother, still seated, still steady, said the thing that I think finally settled the yard back into something like normal. "I want cake now," she said plainly, the way only a woman turning 80 on her own lake dock can say a thing like that and have it work. I did not wait a year for this party to spend it standing around watching my daughters have it out in front of the deviled eggs. "Lena, is that cake ready or not?" A few people laughed, real laughter this time, relieved laughter, the kind that lets a crowd exhale after holding its breath too long, and I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly, enough to say, "It's ready, Grandma," and to mean it as more than just an answer about dessert. "I appreciate you saying that," I said instead, which was true, and was also as far as I was willing to go that night. Then I turned and picked my tray of deviled eggs back up because my hands needed something to do, and I walked back toward the food table. And slowly in pieces the party resumed around me, quieter than before, more careful, but it resumed because 80-year-old birthdays don't stop for anyone's reckoning, not even a necessary one. Carol left about 40 minutes later before the cake, which I noticed and didn't comment on. Frank stayed and found me by the dock afterward and said gruffly, not really meeting my eyes, "She's not a bad person, she's just never learned how to be happy for someone without feeling like it costs her something." I told him I believed that was probably true and that it didn't really change anything about tonight, and he nodded like he understood that too. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. I'd braced for some kind of explosion, a family group chat detonating with everyone taking sides, but what actually happened was slower and in its way more honest. My grandmother called me 2 days later just to talk, and near the end of the call she said, "I should have said something years ago. I'm sorry I didn't. You deserved better than that from your own family and especially from me." I told her she didn't owe me an apology, and she said gently, "Yes, I do. Let me give it to you." I let her. Whitney texted me a few days after that. A long message, longer than anything she'd ever sent me before, about growing up feeling like she had to be perfect so her mother would have something to hold up. About resenting the pressure and resenting, too, that she'd let it turn her quiet whenever her mother went after me. Because speaking up had always felt like it would cost her the one thing she'd been trained to protect, her mother's approval. We talked on the phone for almost 2 hours that night, longer than we'd talked in years, and by the end of it I felt something I hadn't expected to feel toward her, which was something closer to sisterhood than the careful, competitive distance we'd kept for most of our adult lives. Carol didn't call. She sent a card about 10 days later, handwritten, no return address needed since I knew the handwriting, an apology. A real one as far as I could tell, acknowledging specific things: the report card comment, the talent show, the gala post, things I hadn't realized she remembered or admitted to herself she remembered. It ended with, "I don't expect this to fix anything. I just wanted you to know that I know what I did and I'm sorry and I'm going to try to be better even if it's too late for you to want that from me." I kept the card. I haven't decided yet what I think it's worth long term, but I kept it. There was one more conversation from that period I've come back to more than any other, one that happened almost by accident. About 6 weeks after the reunion, I ran into Carol at the grocery store, of all places, both of us standing in the cereal aisle with our carts, and there was a beat where I think we both considered just pretending not to see each other. She didn't. She wheeled her cart over, and for a second neither of us said anything, and then she said, quietly, without any of the performance I was used to hearing in her voice, "I've been trying to figure out why I did it, why I kept doing it for that long to a kid." I didn't answer right away because I genuinely didn't know if I wanted to hear the answer. She kept going anyway. "I think somewhere along the way I decided that if you turned out fine, more than fine, good, really good, the way you clearly have, it meant I'd been unfair to you your whole life, and it was easier to keep believing you wouldn't than to sit with that. I'm not saying that to excuse it. I just wanted you to know I've actually thought about it instead of just sending a card and calling it done." I told her I appreciated her saying so, and I meant it, though I also told her that understanding why she'd done it didn't erase what it had cost me, and she nodded like she'd expected that answer and had made peace with it before she ever wheeled her cart over. We didn't hug. We didn't resolve it fully, standing there under the fluorescent lights with a box of cereal in each of our hands. But it was the first time I believed she was actually looking at the thing she'd done instead of just managing how it looked from the outside, and that mattered more me than I expected it to. My relationship with Carol since then has been careful and distant but not hostile. We're polite at gatherings. She asks real questions about the business now and actually seems to listen to the answers. And last month she ordered a dozen cupcakes from me for a work event and paid full price without being asked, and left a genuinely kind review online, which surprised me more than I expected it to. I don't know if that adds up to forgiveness. I don't know if it needs to yet. My mother says some wounds heal on their own schedule and you don't get to rush them just because it would be more comfortable for everyone else if you did. And I think she's right about that, the way she's been right about most things. The business grew that fall faster than I expected. A write-up in the local paper about the woman who cooked her way out of a diner job into her own catering company. 3 new wedding bookings that came in off word of mouth from the gala, of all things. The same event I'd once thought had finally earned me my aunt's approval. Jean from the diner came in the day the article ran and bought a dozen of everything in the case, just to have an excuse to shake my hand and tell me he'd always known, which made me laugh because I remembered so clearly the specific afternoon he'd said it, the biscuit dough under my hands, how much that one sentence had carried me through months I didn't tell him about. I signed a lease on a small commercial kitchen space in the spring, the first real one, with my name on the door in vinyl letters I still sometimes stop and stare at when I'm unlocking up in the mornings, half surprised it's real. My grandmother comes by most Tuesdays now, sits at the little cafe table by the window with a cup of tea, and tells anyone who will listen that her granddaughter runs the place, unprompted, without needing a photo op or an audience to make it true. She came in on the day I hung the sign out front, actually stood on the sidewalk with her cane and looked up at it for a long moment before she said anything at all. And when she finally spoke, all she said was, "Your grandfather would have liked this. He always said you had his hands." I didn't know what that meant exactly since he died when I was so young, but I understood the shape of it well enough, and I've thought about it more times since than I probably should admit. Whitney finished law school that spring too, and I drove 4 hours to be at her graduation, sitting between my mother and, a little uncomfortably at first, Carol, who spent most of the ceremony dabbing at her eyes with a tissue and at one point reached over without looking at me and squeezed my hand during the applause, the kind of gesture that asks for nothing and doesn't need to be commented on to matter. Afterward, at the small dinner the family had for Whitney, she stood up with a glass of sparkling cider and said she wanted to thank her family. And specifically, she said, looking right at me across the table, she wanted to thank her cousin for reminding her this past year what it actually looks like when someone builds something real instead of just being handed the appearance of it. I hadn't expected that, and I had to look down at my napkin for a second before I trusted my voice enough to say anything back. I think about that mic sometimes, the accident of it, the way a piece of forgotten technology did something none of us had managed to do for 20 years, which was simply make the quiet part loud enough that it couldn't be argued away or reframed or laughed off at the next family dinner. I used to think I wanted an apology, a real one spoken out loud, something dramatic and conclusive. What I actually got was messier than that, a card, a changed tone, a slow rebuilding of trust that isn't finished and might never be, alongside things I hadn't known I wanted, like a real conversation with my cousin or my grandmother finally saying the thing she should have said a decade earlier. I don't think the mic gave me revenge. I think it just gave me the truth, out loud once where everyone could hear it, and it turned out that was enough to build something new on, even if what got built wasn't anything like what I would have designed if you'd asked me in advance. Some nights, closing up the kitchen, flowers still on my hands, I think about 11-year-old me at that porch table with a report card and a D in math, and I don't feel angry at her anymore or embarrassed for her. I just feel like I'd like to tell her it turns out fine, it just takes longer than anyone tells you it will.